Hi, Turi. Welcome to Not Just Ads. And it's a huge, huge pleasure to have you here because you have done so many things. You have been wearing so many hats. And I hope I won't forget any of them. So, Turi Munthe started as an author and journalist, studied history, you studied Hebrew, Arabic, as a journalist, you covered the Second Gulf War. You launched magazines, founded companies, work in academia, and you are currently an advisor and an investor in media companies. Have I left anything out?
It sounds like nobody wanted me to continue a career longer than once, which is why I had to change so often. Alessandro, it's great to meet you. Great to see you here. Thanks so much for having me on the video cast.
Likewise. But regarding what you just said, I think there is a thread, a very powerful thread. You walked the talk. And so I will start with a nuclear question. Are media business models still viable and sustainable? What a
Um,
great start with fireworks.
they are. We just need to figure out how we keep them viable, sustainable, profitable, growing, and exciting investments to make. Um, I historically, I'll perhaps walk you through where I've come to on this because, like
Sure.
you, I've had to change my thinking slightly. I've always felt that the best media models were for profit because there is a kind of honesty that a business model keeps its editor to, on the premise that if you're not representing the audience that you're talking to, they won't pay for your stuff, and that reciprocal relationship does fantastic things for content and has always done fantastic things for content. Um, when you look, however, at giant media businesses like The Guardian or even the Washington Post owned by Jeff Bezos and see that even they are even they are losing money and finding it difficult to keep profitable, we obviously need to rethink the mix of models to keep these things going. So I've worked a lot with small for-profit media. I worked a lot with very big for-profit media. I worked with non-profit media, mostly activist media working around free speech or media pluralism or other things. Um, and there's clearly the need for a mix not just in for-profit business models, advertising and subscriptions and production studios and God knows what else, but also a mix of funding models so that we can continue to do um, the work that media needs to do. And this is, I think, the peculiarity of media is that unlike so many other businesses, it it also serves a very important public function, which is holding power to account um, and informing voting populations what the people they vote for are up to. So there is obviously this sort of people talk about double bottom lines for media business for businesses in general. And you want to be for profit, you also want to be doing something else, you want to be doing good, and media is sort of a classic example of that, which is also why we get into such a tiz when those models look like they're not working anymore. And as you know, the last 20 years, really with the advent of the internet and then the advent of social media, um, and now the advent, of course, of Gen AI and this shift towards chat away from web, um, has upended a business model that really for 100 years was both extremely powerful and did very good work for democracy, and was also super profitable and did very good work for its shareholders. So um, we've had a lot to deal with over the course of the last 20 years. It's probably been 3, 4 generations of technological change. Um, and there's a very nice line somewhere that, you know, new technologies are like viruses, and it takes the human society a certain amount of time to develop antibodies. Well, the media has suffered very many technological viruses over the last sort of generation, and it's not clear whether we have come up with the antibodies yet. But I think it's still worth trying.
Do you think that it's a mistake talking about media business models as one single approach, as in different types of media, different types of audiences, different types of business models?
There is there's a commonality to what I think of as media, and that can be music or fiction or non-fiction or journalism, um, and um, and that's the content part, right? So we're producing content, whatever kind it is, and there are not that many brilliant ways of monetizing content. There's advertising associated with that content or around it or before it or during it, whatever it is. There is paying directly for it. There's subscription models around it, and then there's a bunch of other things that perhaps we'll come to. But I've been looking at and investing in media sort of broadly described, sort of from music to comedy via a lot of news, which is really my bread and butter. And they're not the same. They're of course not the same, but there are lots of learnings to be taken from one and then applied to another. So yeah, I suppose that one can think about the industry generally, although it's a very large industry and so let me just stop there. We can think about the industry generally.
I have a theory that for the future of media, media companies need to hire more media people and less advertising people. As an advisor and an investor, have you come across this kind of dilemma?
Yeah, there are perhaps three kinds of people that media organizations need. There are people who, well, I mean, there are not three kinds of people, but there's the advertising people that you talk about. There's the media people, who historically have been journalists or media producers or whatever it is. And then perhaps the thing which is lacking is sort of the business element which goes on top. And one of the things that you see, especially in newspaper groups where I've spent a bit of time, is that at a certain point, it gets quite difficult to fill middle and top management because journalists who make up the bulk of the organization are really not terribly good, nor are they terribly interested in those jobs. And therefore, pulling in people from the outside who understand that peculiar mix that we were just talking about, which is a mix of, on the one hand, building a fabulous for-profit company, and on the other, really maintaining that commitment to, I suppose, the democratic process generally, is a tricky tightrope to walk, and there aren't that many people who can sort of jump in and do that work. So I think there's probably a skills gap there. More generally, your attack on advertising and the hold that advertising has had over media businesses, and is very well taken. It's ads for the whole kind of paper period of newspapers, but also TV period, was a kind of a convenient evil, not too involved, not too invasive, which helped mitigate the cost of the product. But since we moved online, and the kind of the business model of online was ads, it's kind of like Saturn, it's eaten its children, and it the news business particularly, but a whole bunch of others as well, have seen their strategic directions far too brutally affected by the demands of advertising revenue, because it was a devil's bargain to start with. And the original sin, if you want. I don't know why we're talking in this biblical language, but
Because
maybe because we're facing
it was really
biblical
the
shaped
original one.
proportions. Yeah, exactly. The original sin was, of course, thinking that everything should be free, and we'd be able to build such giant audiences that the advertising would pay for all that stuff. And of course, when everything is free, you build a culture which assumes everything should be free. I'm talking 20 years ago at the start of the web, really. and you train people not to think they need to pay for quality content and stuff that they love. That's changing, and there have been big changes in kind of consumer culture around digital content. Spotify, for example, Netflix, people are now more prepared to pay for digital content. But um, the that bargain, which said audience above everything, led to a kind of an overvaluing and a preponderance of influence of the advertising industry on media, and that's been terrible because you look at so many. But I have a particular bugbear. If we're talking about advertising eating its children, you only need to go and look at most of the newspapers of Reach. Reach is perhaps the biggest local media group in the UK. It owns, for example, the Manchester Evening News and Liverpool Echo. And your eyes are violated by an array of screaming adverts as you go onto the site, which makes it almost impossible to read the news. And that's happened all over the place. I live in Italy now, and a lot of our newspapers, even newspapers I'm very involved with, have also got this extremely unhealthy relationship with advertising because they've lost the traditional revenues that they had from paper and have not been able to translate those yet fast enough into subscription revenues or revenues which come directly from their consumers.
I wonder if the fact of being public companies, some of them, puts extra pressure on them to deliver at all costs.
That's a really interesting point. And we actually saw over the course of the last few years quite a lot of once public media companies being taken private again by their majority owners. So, for example, the Daily Mail Group was taken private by the Rothermere family. JD, the Gruppo Editoriale L'Espresso, um, which owns the Repubblica and Stampa and a host of local newspapers in Italy, was taken private by the Agnelli Elkann family just before COVID. There have been a number of these things for, I think, a smart reason, which is the stock market felt there was kind of no hope for these media companies. They were only going the way of all flesh. Kind of entropy was pulling them to nothing. Um, and I think these media owners, these media buyers, felt that behind the public eye, they would be able to make the kind of necessary transformations which would allow these media companies to come back on the other side, perhaps smaller, but better businesses with a chance to grow.
I would like to understand what are you looking for in a company, in a media company, when you decide to invest.
Great question. Um, what would be my hit list? Well, let's start with table stakes, right? The thing without which there is no media company. And that is a really very good relationship with your audience. And that relationship with your audience doesn't necessarily need to be proved out in numbers terms. You don't need 1 billion views to be able to demonstrate that you've kind of got a hook. But what all media needs to do is to really connect with the people that they're trying to be a media for. Most often, you find that there is because they're the same people. I've watched a bunch of media companies started by people my age for people 20 years younger, and they have all, without fail, failed because you can't represent something that you're not. And maybe represent is a nice word, right? Because
This is crucial.
but maybe represent is a nice word because it has a double meaning. It means on the one hand, you're kind of portraying them, but on the other hand, you're also kind of flag waving for them. So you both reflect your audience back to itself, but you're also like a standard bearer for it. And I feel that the most successful media companies that I've seen have had an element of that. We've invested in media companies from Manchester to Indonesia via the Middle East and India, Mexico, and elsewhere. And I think in every successful case, there's been a very close link between the founders and the people that they're talking to. They're often the same person. So that, I think, is table stakes. Without that, I think you have nothing. But thereafter, what makes for successful media companies, and therefore the things that I try and look for when I'm looking at potential investments, are, well, for a start, multiple revenue streams. To go back to the comment that we were making earlier, you know, um, the days of throwing something up and putting it, putting advertising in it are long dead, unless you have zero content costs, and nobody really has zero content costs. So, um, I suppose I mean, I've looked at media companies which have had upwards of 7 or 8 revenue streams, and that, I think, is the way to
Like,
go.
for example?
Well, let's run through them. Standard advertising, newsletter advertising, subscriptions, memberships. And there's a difference between a subscription and a membership. A membership is kind of like a higher tier of a subscription, or gives you more access to, or allows you to do certain things, etc. Production studios. A whole bunch of media companies did a really good job of taking all the skills that they had in making great content and then going to brands and others and saying, listen, we can do the same thing for you. It was kind of what BuzzFeed was so good at in the early days. Video production, and then consultancy. So one of the things that I've always tried to help my non-profit companies, the non-profit organizations that I've worked with, sort of look at, is they often have a very deep expertise in a specific thing, and that can be, whistleblowing, or it can be, the ins and outs of the humanitarian industry which they're reporting on. I'm thinking of 2 particular cases, but I've always looked at the Economist Intelligence Unit with envy. This is an amazingly successful publication which has actually grown in the last decade, despite this, the kind of the cataclysm affecting most other media companies. And they have had they've always had this Economist Intelligence Unit on the side, which takes some of the learnings, the deep expertise, and the media production skills that they have in-house, and applies it to consulting. So, and not just consulting, they also produce their own reports, etc. But that is a really smart way of sweating your intellectual assets in a different format. So those are a few of the kind of things that we look at. But then, events, merchandise, competitions, and a whole bunch of other things. If you look at the New York Times, I wonder how many distinct business models and revenue streams they have. But it's certainly more than 10. And while it's very difficult to do that with a startup, because you're usually alone, naked in the wind, with your a business idea in one hand and kind of a stick in the other, facing off the elements, you certainly a very early commitment to thinking of all the different ways in which you can monetize is smart.
Yes, I think you can recognize it in the DNA also of a startup, the future potential. And once you are already an investor, are there any interesting tips that you can share with us that you give to your teams or the teams of the companies you are associated with?
I mean, you'd have to ask the people I've invested in. There are cultures of investor, and maybe it's an easier way of describing this. And there's perhaps no better or worse investor culture, but I tend to be I try to be as supportive as possible of the entrepreneur, on the premise that as a board member or CEO, whisperer, or investor, or whatever we like to call ourselves. For us, it's really a very, very, very part-time role, and somebody else has put their entire life and their financial future into this thing, and therefore you've got to assume that they're more invested, literally, and therefore closer to the product than the investor is, and I think that's true, and that means that sometimes things go wrong which you think you could have maybe avoided, but it also means that you're actually allowing the entrepreneur to follow the journey that they're building for themselves, and I think that's important. There are other investors who are much more hands-on, or much more hands-on, or more invasive, and That can be valuable too. There is a one of the advantages of working with early stage companies is that it's in those early stages that you can, in a sense, align the you have most impact in terms of aligning the company, um, and sort of helping it to focus on where it wants to go. So those early months, the first year or two, you can have an impact, but it's really around articulating a vision rather than sweating the details. If you're sweating the details, you probably made the wrong investment because your CEO isn't doing it already.
If we leave the big companies out, I'm sure you come across every day with the small, medium media companies and startups across the world. Have you seen any example of innovative of forward thinking models? Could be the company itself, could be the product that you could share with us.
I
I
mean,
mean, the mill, for example,
well, I should
it's a
start
great
there,
example.
obviously, because I need to declare an interest as I attack the poor Reach, which is this big, local news conglomerate in the UK. I'm an investor in its competitor. Its competitor is a nice word because its competitor is tiny, and just started a couple of years ago. But the mill has been a really beautiful story, insofar as everybody has been decrying the end of local media for the last decade. Local media, which used to be spectacular business up until the 90s and early 2000s, so much so that Warren Buffett kept on investing in local media companies on the premise that they were always going to exist. We've realized that they've had a really tough time. They're difficult to sustain. Most people are interested in national news. So even if you're from a Liverpool or Manchester, you get most of the stuff that you're interested in by looking at the BBC or reading the Guardian or the Telegraph, whatever your politics are. And so the kind of the super local stuff has died, and it's a terrible thing because a lot of politics happens at a local level. And to go back to this fundamental tension in journalism, which is you're a business, but at the same time you're also providing a public function. There are reasons for us to feel very sad and worried by the demise of local news. Um, and then the mill turns up. The mill was founded by a second-time entrepreneur called Yoshi and Yoshi Herman, and um, his bet was that he could produce alone, basically, a single piece of journalism, long form journalism, on a weekly basis, which just enough people might be interested in paying for that it would fund his own life in Manchester. And he started doing that. It turns out that it worked. It worked very well. A little bit of, he was able to build a newsletter to, you know, tens of thousands of people, quite a lot of whom paid, like 7 or 8% of whom paid, and was able to hire other journalists, all doing long form, deep investigations of the kind that we remember from in the 70s and 80s, but also of the kind that have the greatest impact on politics. They are, in a sense, the best version of, holding power to account. Um, and so they were able to spin out of Manchester. They've now launched in Liverpool. They've launched in Sheffield. They're now launching in London, um, and and in Scotland. And he's come up with a very, very cheap model for making great content, which is sustainable, and that's email. So he's built a newsletter, a news business entirely over email, and it's worked spectacularly well. And as I say, we now have over 100,000 subscribers in multiple locations. The learnings of one city then play out in another city, and we're able to grow organically. And I hope we're able to build a really fantastic stable of news organizations doing in-depth reporting in otherwise not quite news deserts, but places which have lost a lot of their kind of the journalism practice, um, and that will make a great business, and do great work.
Do you think that because many others tried but failed in doing that, do you think that the magic element of it is that connection with the audience, understanding the needs and the expectations of the audience, or is it in the depth of the content?
It's you can't do the second without the first. Great question there. So yes, obviously you need to figure out a way of positioning yourself as a product which local people are interested in, which the audience that you're trying to sell to feels a connection to. And Yoshi's done that very well in all the locations which he's built it. But also what we see with the Mill and its sister publications is that the better the reporting, the larger the number of new subscribers we get. So it's a beautiful and direct correlation. The Mill has done some fantastic reporting about municipal corruption, and what they saw was that as that story sort of snowballed and got more important, and more details came out, and they were and the impact of that reporting became more evident, they got many more subscribers. So it's very not comforting. It's a beautiful thing for reporters to realize that the great work that they do for this whole democratic thing of talking truth to power and holding it to account actually pays off, literally pays off. More subscribers, more money, more revenue.
Gen AI is entering the newsroom.
It's fraught insofar as there's a lot of concern amongst journalists, and there's a lot of concern amongst trade unions about the kind of damage that that AI can bring on content businesses. It's the kind of the use case for AI. Gen AI is obviously in our world. So there's a lot of anxiety, and the beginnings of internal legal fights around how Gen AI could be used or could not be used, as trade unions start trying to work out how to defend their position, etc. It's not entirely unlike the fight that we saw in Hollywood last year around the use of Gen AI on scripts and the whole movie production business. My sense is that at least now, Gen AI is accelerating and making a whole bunch of quite difficult work a lot easier for a lot of people, and that's journalists really, who are able to source content, find content, rewrite stuff, reformat articles that they've written in 1800 words, reformatting into 1200, 800, 600, etc. in ways which it just speeds up so much. So there is huge opportunity, and I don't know a single journalist who doesn't use AI every day, multiple times, as I do, as I'm sure you do. The question sort of at the other end, not from a journalist perspective, but from a user's perspective, is how's that going to play out from a trust question? Journalists, like politicians, have been distrusted for the last 100 years. We're the most distrusted profession, and and I wonder whether this kind of this entry of AI into the space, whether it's going to make it better or worse. There is an argument that, which is I think the standard argument, that when the audience believes most of the content that it's looking at has been produced by AI, we'll stop trusting anything at all. But there's another argument, which is when the audience believes that its content and the stuff that it's reading has been produced by AI, they will actually go, okay, we don't have a biased human sitting here in the mix trying to spin stories which I don't really believe in. So who knows how this plays out? It's been one of the great surprises for lots of us. So yes, it's a social experiment. Will humans end up believing more in artificial intelligence than they do in human intelligence? We don't know.
From a commercial perspective, we have seen media companies partnering with AI platforms, media companies suing AI platforms. What's your take?
My take is partner. My take is I'm very much in the partner side.
I agree.
These relationships are going to be tricky, but they're also deeply asymmetrical. And as we saw with media companies trying to sue, the old search engines, Google or even Twitter or Facebook Meta around use of their content. The amounts of money there's a practical element, which is the amounts of money they were able to sue these companies for is tiny, and the time it took to get any kind of resolution was immense, and therefore it's a bad tactical approach. But from a more abstract perspective, um, there is there's all sorts of good reasons to see this as a potentially useful partnership. Insofar as if you look at, ChatGPT doesn't give you sources when on the standard model doesn't give you sources, but Perplexity and others do give you sources, and therefore having your content as a media organization pulled into what will eventually become the standard search box, which is the chat. I think it's super helpful, and working out how you do that early, I think is smart, and I think the smart media organizations have figured out what went wrong in that first clash between platforms, Alphabet, Meta, etc., and media companies, and have learned from that, and I think are taking a different approach this time.
To conclude our conversation, I'm very curious to understand what type of media companies you're excited to invest in.
Alessandro, there's an argument that venture capital has been terrible for media. Hundreds of millions, billions of dollars went into companies like BuzzFeed or Vox or Vice over the course of the last decade or so, and they've been catastrophic investments. They've also been catastrophic for those media companies that went from valuations of over $1 billion to valuations of tiny valuations with massive fluctuations of staff, enormous turnover, and a loss of direction, and fractured identities, etc., etc. Media, in many ways, is fundamentally different from the kind of investments that venture capitalists should be making, which is, here's a widget, it's made by 12 people. If you distribute it properly, it changes the lives of billions of people. I'm thinking of WhatsApp, which was bought by Meta when I think it had 23 employees or something, hitting a billion people. You need that kind of hockey stick opportunity where, if things go right, you become a giant thing very fast and can sustain it because your technology does the work for you. The thing about media is that every day with a media company, you wake up naked. You've got to build the whole thing from scratch every day, every night, by which I mean every minute of the day, because the news is changing. The sea comes in and washes away your sandcastle, which you've got to put back up. So this idea of building, of having a product which just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, it is tough in a media context. So, but over this period of the last few years, I've been seeing an increasing number of niche media companies. I remember about 10 years ago discovering a couple of biochemists who'd put together a newsletter that talked to the 1,000 people that's interested in biochemistry in Europe, and they had a conference, they had a jobs board. They were a great little profitable media company which was cheap to spin up. I remember a couple of German women 10 years ago who were bored of seeing only men on the front cover of The Economist and thought they could build a community of female professionals to talk about the world of work and talk about careers and job opportunities and career progression. And were able to build a fantastic little community there that had the most expensive classifieds board in Germany because everybody wanted to hire these brilliant women. The Mill is another classic example. Very, very cheap to set up, doing fantastically important work, which has real resonance in the communities it speaks to, and is able to grow fast from a low base. The Mill, and I know the CEO, has no desire to be a £1 billion company. What it's looking to do is to build a really great nationwide brand that really serves its local communities with a low cost base, and therefore an easier path to profitability. Those are the companies that I'm most excited by. And I think there's a broader argument, which is to say we will end up our media ecosystem over the course of the next few years is going to really end up with a couple of really very big players and lots of little players. The space in between is the bit which has been the bloodiest waters of all, the most dangerous waters of all. You can't compete with, in the UK, you can't compete with the BBC or the Guardian or the Times or the Telegraph. Those media businesses in the middle have found it very difficult because they've got high costs, but they're not making the revenues anymore. The biochemistry newsletter, the in-depth, long-form news reporting, city by city, the community built for a very specific group of German professional women, for example, those I think work really well and are have a much easier line to profitability because you know who your market is. So I'm excited by these niches, and I'm excited by these niches because I think it's ever easier and ever more cheap to access them. So you can get to sustainability and profitability quickly, and that's great for me as an investor. It's even more exciting for the media entrepreneur who, one, doesn't need to dilute themselves financially in their company too much, but also doesn't have to listen to too many investors telling them what to do.
Thank you for your insights, Turi. I have the feeling that we should have needed 10 episodes to go in depth with on each and every topic. It's a good excuse to have you again in the future. In the meantime, all the best.
Thanks so much, Alessandro. Great to talk as always.